that. And switchies.
You use these to swap.
No worries.
Pretty good dance, but it's certainly good as well.
Yeah, I'll try to stay lively. Cool, so this is a picture in the Midlands where you're actually experiencing kind of concurrent regeneration, lots of little trees coming through, but lots of tree death happening above it. So I do, great intro, but I thought I'd better introduce myself so you're not like, who is this? I am Vanessa. I'm at the University of Tasmania in the School of Geography, Planning and Spatial Sciences. Most of my research tackles either understanding how environments are changing or how humans value and respond to that, or ideally that mixing point between the two. My research at the moment kind of spans from global to local around how we actually stop clearing. If there's one thing to take home today, you have to stop clearing, like absolutely not a single inch more. I'm a big fan of wood floors. I like new clothes. I eat meat. I do all of it. I'm very pro-development. You can do that within your existing footprint. You have to stop clearing. And so that's what the ARC's funded me to look at, as well as how do we stop clearing. And this is the sort of global state of the environment. Tasmania and Australia are probably better and worse on all of these lines. So the first is, how are we responding to loss, where the fundamental primary tool in our toolbox to date has been to just put things in protected areas with the belief that that'll stop salmon farms, stop wind farms, stop clearing, stop bulldozers. We've set global targets. The reality is we're nearing those global targets, and yet we've never seen higher rates of loss of ecosystems. So obviously they're not stopping bulldozers, they're not stopping salmon farms, they're not stopping us from eating or wanting nice things. We probably need new tools to do all the things we like and look after our environment. And then within and outside our protected areas, we have increasing threats, which are also fundamentally changing our environment. So changing fire regimes, which are feedback loops from that climate change, increasing invasive alien species, weeds, ferals, deer. And so those are fundamentally also interacting with these other signals of decline and land degradation. So probably very small print, I apologize, but the probably, 5 things I'd like you to think about that we'll revisit from global to local are that you fundamentally can't manage what you don't know, and making an active choice to not look is still a choice. So if you're making a political choice to just not know the state of the environment because then you are not obliged to act, that is a fundamental choice. Once you know that there's a problem, you're going to have to be willing to stop. I use the very simplistic terminology of bulldozers. I think of trawling in the sea as a bulldozer on your seabed floor. For me, it's a very active imagery of just tearing things down, which is most of the ways we engage with our environment. You have to be willing to actually put in policies that are designed to stop those and be willing to have that conversation with the public, which is most of our problem. We're not willing to admit that we actually, on average, need to stop that, and that it doesn't have to be green tape or bad for the economy. You have to be then able to make smart choices about how to rejig your landscape and to work with your primary producers to do so. You have most of your good land and water resources already under production, so any action outside of that footprint is a very poor use of your land resources, not designed to produce the types of food, the types of fibers, the types of wood that we like. So what you have is actually really all you're going to get. You better learn how to use that, which means working with existing producers to rejig what they're doing, where, and how. In terms of looking after the environment, we actually know what to do. So again, it's not back to, we don't have enough knowledge, we don't have enough research, you shouldn't pay me, you should just go and act. You do fundamentally know what to do and where to do it. And the reality with the way that our environment is structured, the things we care about, the things that are needing action, they're almost all distributed in private freehold land. So you have to work, again, with primary producers and people who own bush blocks to look after that land. So I'll start global. I've more recently begun to work with global agencies around the environmental reports, like through the Intergovernmental Panel for Biodiversity Ecosystem Services, IPBES, and then IUCN around protected areas. So I'll talk about, in general, how is our state of environment going and whether we're actually doing the things that we've committed to doing. And then noting, first of all, the backdrop of where are we globally losing forests? How are we contributing to climate change? How are we losing species that we need to look after? The things in red are areas that have been denoted as global forest loss hotspots. In other words, they're being cleared at a fundamentally astronomically high rate relative to all other background rates. Australia's east coast has the unfortunate acknowledgement of being one of 10 global biodiversity and forest loss hotspots. So, if you look at whose company we're keeping, there's not really a whole lot of excuse for clearing this land. Like, it's not actually really prime productivity. There's no acceptable reason why we, as a developed nation with lots of good industry, should be one of 10 places that are fundamentally clearing forest faster than anyone else globally. And then this map is a species richness map of plants that are endemic. In other words, only found in those botanical countries. So 5 countries hold most of the world's plant wealth. And that because they're only found in those countries, only those countries can actually look after them and meet their obligations. So Australia, Brazil, China, South Africa, and Mexico really hold most of our botanical biodiversity. If we want plants, if we value plants, if we want that genetic resource richness for future foods, future medicine, general wealth and health, we have to look after those. So biodiversity-wise with plants, Australia holds massive obligations to the world. All countries on this map have committed to making sure that they have 100% of their plant species undertaking a conservation assessment so that we know the baseline of where they are, and what we should do to look after them. And so the next sort of pieces will be, are we meeting that commitment? Have we done our assessment so that we know how those species are tracking or not? And what might predict how we're doing? So first we thought, so this is work by Rachel Gallagher, myself, and many others. We thought, what might predict how countries are choosing to meet this commitment or not? Potentially the level of clearing or the level of intactness might predict whether you understand where your plant species are. Perhaps you've already cleared them, so you just don't know. So looking at Australia, we have like quite an arid band of the central Australia it's very intact. The vast majority of the rest of our land resources are highly modified, highly degraded. So I thought maybe that is some predictor of our choices to meet our commitments. And then perhaps the amount of protection also might predict how countries are going. Maybe if you've protected areas, you know more about them, you're more likely to have done your conservation assessments. Again, Australia, that same band that's intact, that's mainly Indigenous tenures, Indigenous freehold, Indigenous communities have chosen to put their land into our National Reserve estate. Whereas then along our sort of East Coast band, we're highly modified, highly degraded, very poor protection levels. And so then this is the proportion of species that have been assessed by country. So countries that are meeting their targets are in yellow. Countries that are terribly, terribly far behind in their global commitments are in reds. Australia is sitting at 0.2. It's just on that threshold from being like in the band of the worst possible status in terms of meeting commitments. So we thought, well, can we predict these patterns? Why, for example, are China and South Africa doing so well? The US isn't actually far behind them. Like, why are those countries capable of meeting their global targets while Australia is not? So Australia is here when we think about, is it potentially because of human development indices, how developed or how wealthy a nation is? More resources, more money, more political will to look after your natural wealth. Potentially that would explain it. So Australia is here. We're very sort of wealthy relative to other countries, and yet we've only looked after about 30% of our conservation assessments. South Africa, China, far less developed, far less wealthy in terms of those metrics, and yet they've nearly met their targets. The US has a similar level of wealth index. They've still met their targets. So that really doesn't predict a country's choice to meet their global commitments. We thought perhaps it's about how much of your land has been modified. Australia, it's quite an unusual geography where that central arid land is very intact and the rest is very degraded. But as a total, we're about 30% degraded, and yet that doesn't explain where we're sitting. So other places are far more degraded, South Africa, China, they're further along that degradation index, and yet they're still meeting their targets. And then we thought, well, maybe it has something to do with choices around how many species you have to get through. So maybe it's just because we have so many. Again, those countries all have more than us, so it's still not explaining that. It's really fundamentally, the only things that explain these are really political ecology, like choices of governments to either do the commitments or not. There's no fundamental barriers there that we can statistically use to predict Australia's choices. And so, on the darker side of things, one might conclude that governments would rather not know the current status of a species, so they don't have to list it, so they're not obliged to regulate it, because that might be an unpopular choice. Fundamentally, the only way to change this is to assess the conservation status of all of our plant species to meet the obligation we've already made to the global community. And once we do that, we'll know which species are in good nick, we'll know which ones are not, and we'll know what we need to do. Once we know what we need to do, it really feeds back into your monitoring of the state of the environment. The state of the environment reports in Australia and in jurisdictions are designed to give you those signals that'll tell you if things are going up or down as they relate to those drivers of loss by species. So it tells you what to do for a species if you've done the conservation assessment. So it's really about designing your state of the environments to actually provide the signals back into your policies if they're functioning well. So, in terms of the state of the environment and what it's telling us and what other kind of signals at global, national, and local scale tell us, the question then is what is driving biodiversity loss and what might we be able to do proactively? So at a national scale, this is modeled plant biodiversity. We modeled all 22,000 species that had sufficient data points in the botanical records. This is just a stacked distribution, so you can see areas of highest richness. East Coast Tasmania, very high richness, low West Coast, low richness, but really unique and endemic. So it means every last inch of the West Coast is something new or different. It's just that they're quite range restricted, so they don't actually co-occur. So it looks like it's low richness, but they're highly unique. We also thought about agricultural land choices, knowing that humans on average, on aggregate, make very rational choices about where we develop land. You're not going to put a business in a place that's not going to make you money. On an individual level, we're terribly irrational, but on a collective economic scale, we're very rational. So areas of 1 are rated as high capability land. It means that you can do just about anything you would want to do production-wise without having to think about major constraints like erosion, gullying, fertilizers. Those soils, those land systems can allow you to produce and be quite flexible in your production choices. The Australian land capability rating puts 8 as extremely low, where they say the only thing that you should do with that land is put a protected area on it. It's so low capability that it probably won't grow much. It's also so thin of soil that you'd erode it almost immediately if you cleared it. So it's pretty hard to see here, but essentially your northern Midlands through kind of to Launceston is high capability. Most of the rest of it is pretty moderate. They're not necessarily the best land systems, so anything that hasn't been cleared is pretty marginal in terms of whether you would want to clear it. And then this is just the footprint of what we've done to date in terms of protected areas, where in Tasmania we're about half protected, but mainly the West Coast. At a national level, we track our progress in terms of meeting our National Reserve System targets at a bioregion level. So anything in light green is a region that's not met its targets that our national Commonwealth government would see as a priority for meeting the National Reserve System strategies. In Tasmania, it's primarily actually that area of quite high capability, already quite cleared from northern Midlands through the meander. The East Coast has a reasonable level of protection, as does the West Coast, but it's quite a story of haves and have-nots. And the problem is really one of, we know protected areas are biased. We've made a range of choices that have resulted in putting protected areas essentially on slopes and tops of mountains, not in basins where we might want to clear. So why might that be? We looked at that bias to try to understand it and predict it, and to understand if that has implications for the types of species you're losing, and if you're losing a fundamentally unique niche of species. And for, depending on what we find based on those species, what might we need to do very specific to their needs. And what we found was both a historic narrative and statistically significant conceptual model. And it's a story of a really intact landscape that was cared for through purposeful custodianship from thousands of years of looking after from Indigenous peoples. The landforms we see and the structures we observe and that we enjoy today are very much ones that were farmed through fire disturbance and purposeful choices about how to live with those places. Colonials arrived, and those colonial settlers largely aggregated in coastal zones and looked for flat areas and grassy areas where it was very easy to put in production systems. So they made fundamental choices about trying to grow where they could in high capability land. Where there was something that got in their way, trees and woody growth forms, they cleared it. When we began to protect, we were already starting from a baseline of loss. So there was preemption. We had missed opportunities to look after unique things. We set targets in our National Reserve strategy that if you're small and unique, I can't find you many places, I want all of you. So I have a larger target for you if you're small and unique. If I can find you anywhere, everywhere, I have a smaller target for looking after you. And what we find is that that is a very much statistically significant model that holds true. It does mean that land capability is a near perfect fit for where we've cleared. And we've cleared nearly every last inch of what's useful. If we haven't gone to it yet, it's because there's water constraints. So it's just a bit harder, or the access to markets is a bit more challenging, like in Northern Australia. And there's just the tiniest bits kind of in the Murray-Darling and kind of upper reaches that we haven't yet gone to for a number of constraints. And because we cleared so much before we got around to protecting, there's also a near perfect inverse relationship. If you're cleared, you're not protected. If you're protected, it's because you were never going to be cleared. Which means that where we can act is pretty obvious at this point. There are places that are very good for production, but because of general access to markets and water storage constraints, we haven't yet figured out how to clear them and make it worth our time, so we haven't done it yet. We should protect at landscape scale, wide range through Northern Australia. These are areas that are also very accessible for protected area systems to make those economically viable. Where there are areas that are heavily cleared but slivers remain that are worth protecting, it is still very much your freehold land in your coastal zones. And in Tasmania, it's pretty much every last inch that's not yet cleared. So it's, this comes back to my point of there's no question mark. There's just no question about what you should be doing. You should be not clearing. And if it's not cleared, it's probably high value. And you should probably be looking at what people who own that land need to change the ways they relate to those places. Which means that in the north, we should absolutely be returning to National Reserve System funding, where we co-fund with states and territories to help look after those lands. The Commonwealth Government should have a real fund, not like a $10 million commitment, like a real fund again for co-purchasing. And then in freehold land, it's not the appropriate place to buy land. You should be understanding who owns that land, what they care about, and what they need to look after it. The curious case of Tasmania, as I call it, is that it is literally half protected. So the political narrative is one of we've done everything we need to do. Fair enough, you've met your area-based targets. Area-based targets currently stand at protect 30% of land and sea. You probably heard that we've done hardly any of that in the sea. So we have not met those targets in the marine area. And new marine protected areas should be part of any conversation around best use of our marine reserves, our marine estate to produce energy, produce food, and look after nature. On land, it's half protected, but it's one bioregion. and the rest of it's quite small reserves that are scattered throughout, surrounded by degraded landscapes, so that it's really hard to look after those places as viable patches. Because we have so much protected, there's often that narrative of we've done enough, but the reality is outside of the 50% protected, it's almost all either fully cleared or very, very degraded. The data available to identify priorities and to identify actions is very, very poor. The investment in our data streams is the lowest of all the states and territories. We have no vegetation management regulation. Makes it really hard to tell people they're not allowed to clear. We have very weak land use planning strategies and policies, which makes it really hard to help people make better choices about where to clear. And we have policies that incentivize perverse outcomes like irrigation schemes that changed choices to clear in areas that people would not have otherwise cleared and now regret that and are trying to restore. So, what's the solution in a system like this? Is to not undervalue the importance of protected areas. We haven't done enough. They are still important. And when there's opportunities, we should still have those on the agenda. Most of those opportunities probably will be covenanting in private land, and we shouldn't put barriers to stop people from doing that. So there's currently like a sort of purposeful, in my opinion, no academic evidence, but in my opinion, a purposeful rationing of covenants because we don't want to lock it up. Those are people's properties. It's their personal private landholder choice. And the system should be there to allow them to do that. And beyond that, where they don't want to lock it up, fair enough, but help them to look after it in ways that are meaningful to them. And there's lots and lots of people that want to do so. Which brings me to hopefully my last point, and hopefully I'm not running too long, which is voluntary conservation programs are probably your largest untapped resource of people who want to look after nature, who are already looking after nature, who just need to be recognized and supported in doing so. It doesn't have to be about contracts and money. And in contracts and money often crowd out the many willing. So you should be thinking about nature repair markets and ways to change production systems, but outside of those, you should be recognizing how much people are already doing and supporting them. And so when we research these systems and these types of people, we've been using a cycle called the Noticing Nature cycle, which essentially is one of people connect to nature, and as you connect to nature, you learn to love a place just like you learn to love your home or your school or your community. And as you become more attuned to that, you start to engage in your own land management or stewardship practices that changes your environment and creates a feedback loop where species change, flowers bloom, birds come in. You have more of a diversity of nature encounters, which reconnects you to nature and begins to deepen that cycle of voluntary loving and looking after nature. And so we essentially asked through national, state, and local surveys whether program participants have a greater connection to nature. And so these are 3 bars, which we'll go through, but essentially nature connection with the scale we used is one that is essentially a 10-point scale. And Australia as a whole sits at about 6 out of 10. I don't actually know how that compares globally, but I would guess that it's probably pretty high. Tasmania is at about 6.2, so like just ever so slightly above our national average. And those who are already choosing to present themselves into voluntary programs are at like an 8.5. So people who are more connected to nature want to access resources to look after nature, presenting a self-feedback loop. They're your coalition of the willing. When we ask these people what they're already doing, out of 100%, about 75% manage their land, whether it be a garden, a bush block, or a massive piece of land for wildlife. When they plant plants, they only plant native plants, 90% of them. 90% of them are actively removing weeds and looking after feral animals, trying to get rid of them. And 50% are having conversations with their neighbors about doing that as a collective to reach scale. So I guess my point with that is that voluntary programs are actually incredibly important. We're mildly obsessed with permanency, but nature is not permanent. Nature is certainly not permanent in rapid times of global climate change. And people, it's okay to not be permanent. It's okay to be voluntary. It's okay to not have some kind of contract or promise. Those people are far more likely to be doing the same thing on the same patch 20 years from now, while the government will have changed 4 times with a new policy, new ways of clearing, new ways of producing. These actually have longevity, and that matters. So fund program holders so that the programs have longevity. Given our highest priority areas for protecting biodiversity are in private land, it does mean that you can't assume that you don't need to pay. Like sometimes you need to pay, but you don't always have to pay. Don't put all of your eggs in nature positive offsetting. Like if we design different programs for different types of people, voluntary is actually where most of your people are as a segment of society. Economic incentives can actually deeply offend this type of person. It can really put them off and crowd them out from looking after nature. So not only do you not have to pay, trying to pay them can very much harm the outcomes you're looking for. And voluntary programs can build really strong relationships with those people in nature, but also amongst themselves, so that they tend to be self-growing. We have yet to see interest in these programs tap out. So most diffusion of programs kind of does your sort of S-curve, where eventually you hit a maximum threshold of interested parties. We have yet to see that in these. It's a constant self-presenting of friends and neighbors and new people as they learn about the programs, which suggests that that sort of social relational aspect of communities is helping grow programs organically. So, state of the environment in Australia and in Tasmania is a story of habitat loss. We've been extraordinarily good at clearing land. We've not stopped, we've only increased that. And that presents real risks to our national security. Environment is a bipartisan issue. It should be treated in the same way as the defense and education and health are. We cannot have healthy economies, healthy people, without a healthy environment. So it has to be, we have to find a way to get it to a point where we can have rational political conversations where policies may differ, but that we value nature, and nature is not a barrier, is the fundamental point of understanding. And monitoring should be seen as a political responsibility, not an optional extra. And there should ideally be responses to the signals we're seeing of degradation. There should be a level of collective environmental alarm that we've let things get way out of whack, and that while different governments may choose different policies, that we fundamentally are on the same page that we have to fix things. And I would argue, probably just because it's the way I think about things, but you have to put people first. You're not going to get a policy in place. You're not going to get programs in place. You're not going to reach scale at the level you need to reach to stop environmental loss if you don't put people first. You have to understand why people love places, the relationships they hold. You have to have mutual respect that producers have the same love for nature as people in cities. We just express it in different ways. We need different tools in our toolbox to look after place, particularly in light of climate change, as we have to accept that these places will look fundamentally different in the future. So aside from the environment, state of the environment, I've just put a bunch of references that kind of fed into the state of the environment that are hopefully not too academic, but I can send them around if anyone wants things.
Vanessa, do you have to run?
No, I have children that are getting picked up, and it's totally fine for the next 30 minutes.
Derek. Vanessa, great talk. A comment and a query, if I may.
Yes.
We've known since the 1980s, at least 40 years, that habitat loss is the greatest driver of biodiversity loss in Australia.
Yep.
That's land and sea. We've done nothing about it.
Yep.
Business as usual for 40 years. So I agree with you, but I just can't see how we're going to change that paradigm. It hasn't changed in 40 years. My other comment was going to be, you made the comment about the bias in protected area selection or allocation, whatever. I would actually argue it's probably even stronger or a greater bias or greater misrepresentation in the marine environment than there is in the terrestrial environment?
Yep. Well, I mean, there's a stronger bias and there's a lot less of marine protected areas. So I think in Tasmania, there's 1% of marine area or less that's protected. I think we have like 4 or 5 marine protected areas that I can think of. So marine protected areas have fallen to an even further narrative of we don't need them because we hardly fish them. Also, we have fisheries, so why would you bother? As we ramp up interests in, and to some level, perhaps that's true. We have a very small population. We only fish in a few places. On the West Coast, no, it's not very fishable. It's pretty hard to get to. But that's also fundamentally not true in other places. As we ramp up our interest in using our marine environment for multiple uses, recreation, energy production, farming, extractive fisheries, we have to think about that as just like we would land use plan on land, we need to sea use plan to make very structured choices about how to best use those areas. And marine protected areas should always be a bargaining chip. If we're going to expand farming in our sea areas, we should expand protection in our sea areas.
I made the comment this morning in my talk that at the moment the marine spatial planning that's occurring in Tasmanian waters is being driven by the agriculture and offshore renewable industries.
Yeah, look, I'm probably one of the scientists that's done the science behind the marine spatial planning. So I am, again, actually not at all offended and do eat salmon. I'm probably an unpopular person in this room. I also very much want clean energy. I'm 100% willing to have renewable energy in my sea areas. But I do think that you can do all of those alongside marine protected areas, and I don't think that we should explore expanding any one of those extractive uses or layered uses in our marine area without a very structured consideration of where do they not belong? Where do they belong and where do they not belong? And how do we protect places that do not work well with those productive uses?
But we're not doing that in the terrestrial environment, so we're not doing
No,
it in the marine environment.
of course not. And out of sight, out of mind. So if it's anything that's vaguely offshore, we don't know what's happening, we therefore don't care. And to be honest, it's the same with private land in Tasmania. Because the Midlands, you drive through the center of it on a highway, you don't get off-road and it's somebody else's property. So it's absolutely out of sight, out of mind. We're not demanding better legal and policy frameworks to regulate how we use those lands.
You said a large component of private landowners are motivated to conserve their land, but not financially motivated, that detracts from them. So how can we support private people to conserve on their own land more systematically? Is it just a matter of pumping up land care to be stronger and more active, or are there alternative channels we should be using to support these private landowners?
Yeah, well, look, what I would ideally want in a system is more land care, more NGO-supported private land programs like Land for Wildlife, which is supported currently through the Tasmanian Land Conservancy, and active programs through the government, because different people trust different types of groups to be supported by. And sometimes they're in everyone kind of person. So that we certainly have some participants who both do land care and Land for Wildlife, also a covenant through the government. But more often you see people that have a strong preference for land care because they trust them, or for TLC run programs because they trust them, or the government. So having all of those parties running active and meaningful and well-resourced programs means you have something on offer for everyone. And then making sure that programs have longevity in terms of funding. So the kind of 3-year funding blocks and prove your worth and apply for grants is a huge waste of that organizational capacity. If you know the program is needed in longevity, it should be funded in longevity, it should be in forward budget forecasts at all times.
Just following up from what was said then, locating wind and solar farms, utility scale on possibly degraded farmland. Which would be better, wind or solar? Incentive for farmers to make use or get an income from that degraded land. Solar takes up a lot of area, wind farms.
Yep. This is actually a question we're actively trying to answer with a systematic quantitative lit review. So I don't know the fundamental answer yet because we're still weeding through what the global literature says around what are your best energy production options if you're trying to minimize your impacts on, say, your biodiversity that sits underneath them. And it probably depends on what you're thinking about. So wind farms might be really high production for energy in places that also happen to be migratory pathways for birds. So you'd have to think about what biodiversity you're worried about and what those impacts are that you're weighing up. I mean, first you have to, and this is not hard science at all, first you should have a layer that tells you the highest productivity for each of your clean energy uses. And then with maps of biodiversity, you can look at what are your best energy production choices that minimize harm on the environment. Noting that all of them are better than coal, so that's also not a question mark. Yes, Jason?
So I think just pivoting off that question, we often get trapped into these either or sort of categories, not thinking about changes in the technology as well. So a wind farm doesn't necessarily mean turbines with blades of the length of a 747 wing.
Yeah.
There are new kinds of wind turbines around now that just vibrate.
Yeah.
And even smaller versions that can still be deployed at scale that might not be taking out wedge-tailed eagles, for example, right? So I think sometimes we fall into that trap, don't we?
We do, and I can see that you are like inching at it. We'll go there. Look, I think if this were a personal opinion, I honestly would put money on wind, particularly with the science and research that's happening in this state around options to build into turbines to minimize harm. So AI detection of birds and bird impacts. We're learning really rapidly the best ways to design those so that they give us longer longevity of actual infrastructure and have built-in stop measures to avoid hitting birds. So like with little birds, like the technology and the proof in the pudding doesn't seem to be 100% there, but so I'd be concerned about like orange-bellied parrots still, but for like big birds, the technology honestly seems phenomenal. Like if I was a betting man with more than an academic salary, I would personally be there, and you can cows below it. And I'm sure that there's a different opinion or better knowledge of science.
Based on having been involved in wind farm assessments in Tasmania on and off for 20 years, the single biggest constraint that we have is that every wind farm proposal in terms of its location, topography, layout of turbines and species involved is a unique combination. So it's very hard for us to take the lessons learned from one wind farm and transplant them to another wind farm. We can generalise, but at some point in time the generalisation breaks down. We're not in a position to have strong predictive powers. Vis-a-vis the AI detection of birds, it takes 500,000 images of a species for the software to learn what a profile looks like in radar. In some locations, the radar location works fine. Lake Echo, they've only killed 3 wedge-tailed eagles since they've started operating. At other wind farms, they swear at the software rather than with the software because it doesn't work. They get more false positives than real detections, and so it's very much a case by case. We need to be careful that we don't generalise too quickly or too broadly when, as I said, fundamentally the constraint is that each wind farm proposal, offshore and onshore, is unique, and we can only draw so much for others in terms of extrapolating along the way. I don't disagree with you. I just think we need to be a little bit more cautious.
Yeah. Look, I mean, and I will be like 100% say that I think all of these are trade-off choices. My structured internal personal decision making is that I think climate change is such a hierarchically existential threat that we face that we have no other choice other than to solve our energy needs. And I'm not planning on not having electricity in my personal home anytime soon, so I urgently need collective political action to solve our energy needs. That being said, there's always a structured choice within those energy systems about how to best meet our collective energy needs while minimizing harm. I'm also a plant person, so I tend to get really sad about thinking about putting a bunch of things on top of plants. Again, my total personal trade-off, internal system, whereas I'm much less of a bird person, but I'm also a collective functional ecosystem person.
That's probably a non-expertise question, but we're in the education building at the moment who aren't affiliated with the political party. We've got amazing academics here, which is great, who aren't necessarily affiliated with a political party. Maybe they're with the Greens, fair enough. The conclusion you reached when you're talking about why we aren't acting more, why we aren't doing more, it seems like the comment on political action, where people aren't engaged in politics, people aren't members of political parties. We're at the lowest political participation rate in our history. I guess my other question is on what we can do. The only thing that made me feel better as a climate kid was joining a political party. It's the only time I've ever felt less depressed about all of what we're talking about. So I guess when it comes to you advocating for what your research says, and that conclusion that it's political action that is required, I guess I just wonder what comments and thoughts you have on how we make change in a world where the appetite for change is so low.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this. I mean, I think that where we've seen success in holding governments up to a higher standard, it's a bit of a layered approach of the governments themselves how to get to a point where they agree internally that something is so fundamentally important that it is not on the table to act. It is on the table to revise what the strategy is, because governments will differentiate themselves, but they won't negotiate the bottom line. So that's where we've gotten to when it comes to national defense and like those types of things. You're not going to not have national defense. You might change whether you want nuclear subs or something else. We've seen governments get to that point with the environment, but it's always a little bit fuzzy to have deep politicking to understand how they've gotten to that point. I do think that some of that's fundamentally a groundswell from the bottom up of putting demand on government. So we don't actually see this as a horse trading. The issue being that when we have political swell from only one segment of society, we're only feeding into that this is a voting issue. This isn't a voting issue. We don't want this to be a voting issue. We want this to be a policy and action issue. If it's a voting issue, then it means it's always at risk because it'll become on the table and off the table and on the table and off the table. So it's not a voting issue, it's an everybody issue. So how to get all of society to have a groundswell of demand from our leaders without it being the Labour Party's run a really active campaign to get their voters to put demand, I think is the ultimate question, which obviously isn't like, what you're thinking about today. But I think that's fundamentally, if we wanted to see change on the environment platform, that's where we would have to get to.
That for a campaigner like me is rather shocking idea. John, can you remember when the last big student strike for climate change rally was on? It was 2016?
I think it was more recent. It was just pre-COVID.
No, the big one they had where they had about 26,000 people. First one, what date was that?
It's been a while, hasn't it?
The point is, if you took a third of that population, they were a lot of young kids. It's about 8 years ago now, and they are now moving through and becoming voters. And Labor and the Liberals both see declining votes in their voter base. I'm wondering if that is actually those voters. So in Hobart, there are enough young voters, or pre-voters, to change the outcome in both Clark and Franklin. There is enough of them there.
I mean, if you can organise 100 humans to join any political party, that is enough influence to sway the decisions of government. It's just 100 people. But yeah, we don't have the political will across the spectrum. So.
I think that's the last point that really matters, right? So, my daughter will be voting soon. She's 15, almost 16. She's done an internship with the Greens. She really cares deeply about the environment, but she's also seen some of the hypocrisy among the Greens, who tend to be white and wealthy, and tree huggers don't look after poor people. So really what we need, as Vanessa is suggesting, is something that cuts through the tribalism and instead presents a kind of multi-party commitment across the board to bringing about something different, so we don't just get knocked down by Labor versus Greens or Labor versus Libs or Libs versus Greens, this kind of stuff, because that's where we fall apart. Is that fair to say, Vanessa?
Yeah, exactly. Like, I'd love to be I'll get to you. Just picking up on that. I think what I'm trying to articulate is that in a perfect world, if we could get to it in, say, the next, ideally, 2 to 5 years, would be that both parties have viable, strong, but different environmental policies. It's not there's the environmental fringy thing, and then there's the we care about jobs thing. There's everyone agrees environment is good for jobs and people. However, there's different ways to do that. One party might believe in solar and solar on households and greening our urban environments, and one might be about marine protected areas, but there'd be viable alternatives that are different and compelling to different markets, but that both are on the same page that the environment is a non-negotiable.
I just
Yeah.
want to talk about national lean lobbying in Canberra recently.
That comes at the very end.
I just want to make a quick comment. I spent quite a few years designing wind farms here in Australia and the US and Canada, and I think it comes down to messaging, right? So on the west coast of the US, my messaging was always about its environmental credentials. In the Midwest, it was always about energy independence, right? You know, getting away from the Middle Eastern oil, that sort of thing. And on the East Coast, it was all about how much money you could make out of it.
Yeah.
And I think we need to think about that too from an environmental perspective. Is like, I now do energy efficiency work and solar panels, and so it's the same thing when I deal with solar now in Australia. Like, if I can tell someone that's only interested in money, I don't talk about the environmental credentials of it. I get them to decarbonise based on the fact they're going to make money out of it, right?
Yep.
I think that's important that we just keep in mind the messaging.
No, I completely agree.
I'm just checking the time. We're starting into John's time. After this session, there's going to be lots of discussion and emails and stuff. I will undertake to get all those references that Vanessa's put up and distribute to everybody who wants them. Vanessa, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Can you work the magic with John's presentation?
Yeah, yeah.
Where is it?